Hello and welcome to lecture number 14. This is topic 2.3, Capture and the Impact of the Slave Trade on West African Societies. The first learning objective is to describe the conditions of the three-part journey enslaved Africans endured during the transatlantic slave trade. The first part is the march to the coast. Many of the people who were enslaved were captured and marched from the interior states. The abductions were done by other Africans who were utilizing European weapons to sell these captives for finished goods, weapons, and sometimes New World items like rum. For example, the Kingdom of Dahomey in present-day Benin engaged heavily in capturing and selling war captives. They marched the captives in coffles or chains that traditionally connected captives by the neck. The march to the coast, where they would be sold to be put on slave ships, could last several months. When they arrived at the coast, they were held in barracoons, or hastily made barracks. Other times, they'd be held in dungeons of factories or fortified buildings on the coast. Often, these were very crowded, with captives chained together in unsanitary conditions. Human waste would often sit in the gutter of the cell, and there would be very little ventilation or light, and they could be held in these areas for weeks or even months as they awaited a slave ship to transport them across the Atlantic. Examples of these factories include the Portuguese fortification at Elmina Castle off the coast of Ghana and Gorée Island, located off the coast of Senegal, which traded hands between the Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French. The second part of the journey is called the Middle Passage. It started when the captives were taken from the dungeons or barracoons and bought by the captains of slave ships. They would be rowed to the larger slave ship, waiting in open water or a natural bay. Often, the slave ships would only buy a few enslaved people at each trade post off the coast of Africa, so it could take several weeks for a slave ship captain to fill his cargo and finally head off to the New World. Once they did sail off, they used the westward currents and the prevailing winds, usually launching from the Canary Islands to pick up these prevailing winds. Depending on the size of the ship and any interruptions that happened during transit, the passage could take between 2 to 3 months. Some ships, like the notorious Brooks, could carry up to 600 enslaved people, far exceeding its official capacity. There were many difficulties for the captives during the Middle Passage. The overall death rate across the entire transatlantic slave trade was about 15%, but it was definitely higher in the earlier years of the slave trade. Inhumane treatment was rampant. Captives could be humiliated, beaten, or punished for not being obedient. The traditional weapon of choice for the slave ship captains was the cat o' nine tails, a whip. Women faced the constant threat of rape, and enslaved people were placed in the cargo hold below the deck of the ship, where there was less than 30 inches of headroom when lying down. They were chained together, often in pairs, and stuffed beyond the actual capacity of the ship. Diseases such as smallpox, scurvy, and dysentery were common and difficult to control among the human cargo. Enslaved people were usually fed twice a day, but some captains skimped on the food cost to increase their profit margins, leading to malnourishment and death. Those who died on board were then thrown overboard, and sharks were known to follow the ships, anticipating the bodies that were being discarded. In one infamous incident in 1781, the crew of the British slave ship Zong threw 132 sick and dying slaves overboard to claim insurance money. The final part of the journey was the arrival at the port. Upon arrival, captives were quarantined to recover from illnesses and ensure diseases did not spread further. They were washed, their bodies oiled to hide any blemishes or scars, and their hair was dyed to mask gray hairs. By far the most cruel and humiliating practice during this time was to stuff up the anuses of people that were suffering from dysentery using hemp. That way their ailment would be hidden long enough to pass the inspection of a potential buyer. The enslaved would be lined up on the deck of the ship, and buyers would be invited aboard to inspect them before purchase. Slave ships rarely sold all their human cargo at one location or at the first port of arrival, so it could take several months for a captive to be sold to a potential plantation. Often they started in the Caribbean islands and then made their way up to Charleston, South Carolina. Upon arriving at their destination, captives underwent a seasoning period where they were trained on plantation work and instilled with obedience, often through beatings. Seasoning often included brutal practices to break the spirit of the captives, making them more compliant. Enslavers frequently gave them new names, often after famous Greek or Roman figures, as a way to strip them of their identity and humanity. The second learning objective is to explain how the transatlantic slave trade destabilized West African societies. The slave trade actually predated European interactions. Slavery already existed in Africa before the Portuguese arrived, but after the Europeans arrived, the monetary incentives increased, leading to more violence and capturing of people from rival factions to sell them into slavery. For instance, the Oyo Empire in present-day Nigeria expanded its military campaigns to capture more slaves. Prior to European arrival, more women and children were enslaved than men because the market for enslaved people was usually across the Sahara, where they often became servants or concubines. After European arrival, domestic wars between kingdoms were exacerbated by the firearms provided by Europeans, and captives were now more often men. Coastal kingdoms benefited from capturing and selling people from neighboring societies, increasing their control and influence in the region. Coastal states that dealt with Europeans became wealthy from the trade in goods and people, selling war captives from opposing ethnic groups. The Kingdom of Congo, the Ashanti in modern-day Ghana, and the Dahomey in modern-day Benin are examples of kingdoms that benefited greatly from the slave trade. By the time the European countries were considering banning the practice of the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century, these kingdoms lobbied against its abolition. King Gezo of Dahomey famously declared in the 1840s that the slave trade was the source of his kingdom's wealth. Conversely, interior states became less stable under the constant threat of capture and enslavement. The loss of people and family members who could have assumed leadership roles, raised families, or passed on traditions led to weaker political systems. The decimation of male populations and the incentivization of coastal states to continue capturing people resulted in more civil wars among the interior states. For example, the Bambara Empire in present-day Mali faced increased instability and conflicts due to the slave trade. The last learning objective is to describe the key features and purposes of narratives written by formerly enslaved Africans. A slave narrative is a genre of literature in which formerly enslaved Africans detail their experiences. Famous examples include Olaudah Equiano's The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Solomon Northrup's 12 Years a Slave, transcribed by another author, and Frederick Douglass's Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Slave narratives also included genres of poetry such as Phillis Wheatley's poems on various subjects, religious and moral. Slave narratives are foundational to American literature, and they serve as historical accounts documenting the horrors of the Middle Passage and the lives of enslaved people on plantations. For example, Equiano's memoir describes the Middle Passage, while Northrup's 12 Years a Slave details plantation life and the strategies plantation owners used to increase productivity. They also serve as literary works on their own, with Wheatley gaining recognition for her poetry during her lifetime. Additionally, slave narratives served as political texts, advocating for the end of slavery and the slave trade, demonstrating Black humanity. Douglass's narrative fits this description, as do works by other Black writers like David Walker's An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, which advocated for the inclusion of people of African descent in American society. Mary Prince's narrative, The History of Mary Prince, a West Indian Slave, was the first account of the life of a Black woman to be published in the UK, highlighting the brutality of slavery in the British colonies. Finally, here's a recap. The journey of enslaved Africans started in the interior of Africa, continued across the Atlantic, and persisted after the arrival in North America. African kingdoms engaged in the slave trade to maintain wealth, power, and influence in the region, but the loss of population left a lasting legacy of instability in Africa. Finally, slave narratives are foundational to early American writing, serving as literary works, historical accounts, and political texts. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.